Hey there, and welcome to another journey through the quieter corners of history. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight, whether you're settling in for sleep or just looking to slow the pace of your evening. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the globe. There's something wonderfully comforting about knowing we're all drifting through these old stories together, no matter how far apart we might be. If this kind of gentle historical storytelling helps you unwind, feel free to subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. Now, dim the lights if you haven't already. Maybe pull that blanket a little closer. Tonight we're travelling back to a time when the world was smaller, harder, and infinitely more dangerous for half the population. We're going to explore why life was brutal for women in medieval times, but we'll do it softly, gently, like turning the pages of a very old book by candlelight. You might think you know about medieval life from movies and stories. Knights in shining armour, ladies in flowing gowns, chivalrous romance beneath castle walls. But strip away the romantic veneer and you'll find a world where being born female was perhaps the greatest challenge anyone could face. A world where a woman's life was not her own from the moment she drew her first breath to the moment she drew her last. Let the day's worries fade now as we step back through the centuries. Back to a time when survival itself was an act of courage, and for women, simply existing was an act of defiance against a world determined to silence them. In the dim light of a medieval dawn, as roosters crowed and church bells echoed across cobblestone streets, a girl child might open her eyes for the very first time. But even in that moment, before she could form her first cry, her fate was already sealed by forces beyond her understanding or control. The midwife attending the birth might pause, just for a heartbeat, before announcing to the waiting household whether this new soul was a blessing or a burden. Because in medieval times, the difference between being born male or female wasn't just about biology. It was about destiny. From the moment a medieval girl took her first breath, she entered a world that had already decided what she was worth. Her father, if he was a man of means, might feel a flicker of disappointment. Another dowry to save for, another mouth to feed until she could be married off. Another delicate creature to protect in a world that showed little mercy to the vulnerable. If he was poor, that disappointment might deepen into something approaching despair. How would he afford to keep her fed, clothed and safe until some man agreed to take responsibility for her? But let's follow one such girl through her early years, shall we? Let's call her Marguerite, born in a small village somewhere in what we now call France. In the year of our Lord 1347, the world she opens her eyes to is one of thatched roofs and mud-packed floors, of smoky hearths and perpetual twilight. Her mother, exhausted from childbirth, holds her close and whispers a prayer, knowing all too well the challenges that lie ahead for this small, fragile life. Marguerite's infancy unfolds in a world where death is as common as sunrise. Medieval infant mortality rates were staggering, with nearly half of all children dying before their 5th birthday. But for girls, the dangers were compounded by neglect. In times of scarcity, and there were many such times, families faced impossible choices. When food ran low, when illness struck, when resources had to be rationed, it was often the daughters who received less. Not out of cruelty, necessarily, but out of cold calculation. Sons would carry on the family name, inherit property, and provide for aging parents. Daughters would eventually belong to another family entirely. As little Marguerite grows from infant to toddler, she begins to understand her place in the world through 1,000 small lessons. She watches her mother defer to her father in all things, speaking only when spoken to during meals, keeping her eyes downcast when visitors call. She sees her older brother learning to read simple words from the village priest, while she's taught to spin wool and tend the fire. These aren't formal lessons about gender roles. They're simply the natural order of things, as unchanging as the seasons themselves. By the time Marguerite reaches her 6th year, her childhood, such as it was, begins to fade. While boys her age might still have time for games and mischief, she's already being trained for her future role. Her tiny fingers learn to weave, to sew, to prepare simple meals. She helps her mother tend the family's small garden, learning which herbs might ease a fever, which roots could be ground into flour when the harvest was poor. These skills aren't hobbies or interests, they're survival tools, because a medieval woman's worth was measured almost entirely by her usefulness. Education, that great gateway to opportunity and independence, remains largely closed to her. While wealthy families might occasionally hire tutors for their sons, daughters were considered incapable of serious learning. The prevailing wisdom of the time held that women's minds were too weak, too easily confused by complex ideas. Why waste time teaching a girl to read when she would spend her life managing a household? Why teach her mathematics when her husband would handle all financial matters? This wasn't seen as oppression. It was seen as natural law, as immutable as the rising of the sun. But perhaps even more troubling than what Marguerite wasn't allowed to learn was what she was forced to accept about her own nature. From the pulpit every Sunday, she heard that women were the source of sin in the world, that Eve's transgression in the Garden of Eden had cursed all womankind with weakness, wickedness, and an inability to resist temptation. She was taught that her body was shameful, dangerous, capable of leading righteous men astray simply by existing. The Church, which dominated every aspect of medieval life, preached that women were necessary for procreation, but were otherwise inferior beings, closer to animals than to the divine. This religious doctrine wasn't just spiritual teaching, it was legal foundation. Medieval law, heavily influenced by church doctrine, treated women as perpetual minors. A woman could not own property in her own name, could not enter into contracts, could not appear in court without a male representative. From birth to death, she was always under the legal authority of some man, her father, her husband, her son, or in desperate circumstances, a male relative who might or might not have her best interests at heart. As Marguerite approaches her 10th birthday, the conversations around her begin to change. Her parents start discussing her future in hushed tones after she's gone to bed. Not her dreams or aspirations, those are irrelevant, but her prospects. Which families in the village have sons of marriageable age? What kind of dowry would be expected? How long do they have before they must find her a husband? Because by medieval standards, 10 is already getting old to be unmarried. Many girls were betrothed by age 7 or 8, with marriages taking place as soon as they reached what the church considered the age of consent, 12 years old. The concept of romantic love, of choosing one's own partner based on affection or compatibility, simply doesn't exist in Marguerite's world. Marriage is a business transaction, a merger of families, a transfer of property and obligations. The bride's feelings about the arrangement are as relevant as a cow's opinion about which farmer buys her. She will go where she's told, marry whom she's told, and be grateful for the protection and security that marriage provides, however meagre that protection might be. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before Marguerite can be married off, she must survive her childhood, and that survival is far from guaranteed. Medieval children faced constant threats from disease, malnutrition, accidents, and violence, but girls faced additional dangers that their brothers did not. They were more vulnerable to abuse, more likely to be sold or traded if times got hard, more expendable when difficult choices had to be made. The medieval world was not kind to the vulnerable, and women were vulnerable by definition. They were physically weaker in a world where might often made right. They were economically dependent in a system that offered them no independent means of support. They were legally powerless in a society that treated them as property rather than people. They were spiritually condemned by a religion that blamed them for humanity's fall from grace. And yet somehow they endured. They found ways to survive, to carve out small spaces of agency and dignity within a system designed to crush them. They passed down knowledge from mother to daughter, preserving skills and wisdom that kept their families alive. They formed networks of mutual support with other women, sharing resources and information when the men in their lives failed them. They developed a quiet strength, a resilience born of necessity, that allowed them to bear burdens that would have broken stronger backs. As we follow Marguerite through these early years of her life, we begin to see the shape of the challenges that await her, the limited options, the constant dangers, the crushing weight of expectation and restriction. But we also begin to see the remarkable courage it took for medieval women to simply continue existing day after day, year after year, in a world that offered them so little hope for anything better. The story of women in medieval times isn't just a tale of oppression, though oppression certainly plays a central role. It's a story of human endurance, of the ways people adapt and survive even in the most hostile circumstances. It's a reminder of how far we've come, and perhaps more importantly, how precious and fragile the freedoms we now take for granted truly are. But we're only just beginning to understand the full scope of what medieval women faced. We've seen how their childhood was shaped by limitation and preparation for a predetermined future. Now we must follow them into that future, into the realities of medieval marriage, motherhood, and the daily struggle for survival in a world that seemed determined to grind them down. The church bells are ringing vespers now, and young Marguerite helps her mother prepare the evening meal. She doesn't yet know that in just 2 short years, her parents will announce her betrothal to the son of a neighbouring farmer, a boy she's barely spoken to, 14 years older than her slight frame. She doesn't know that her childhood, such as it has been, is nearly over. She doesn't know that the greatest trials of her life are still ahead of her. But the shadows are growing longer, and there's more of her story to tell. More threads to follow through the complex tapestry of medieval women's lives. The sound of her wooden spoon stirring the evening stew echoes softly in the gathering dusk, a gentle rhythm that will soon give way to much harsher realities. Rest now. Let these images settle in your mind, like dust motes in candlelight. There's more to discover about Marguerite's world, more to understand about the women who lived, loved, and lost in those distant times. But for now, let the soft murmur of medieval voices fade into the quiet of your evening, carrying with them the whispered stories of those who came before, those who endured, and those who somehow, against all odds, found ways to make their lives matter. The morning mist clings to the village like a shroud, as Marguerite, now 12 summers old, wakes to find her fate sealed overnight. Her parents have made their decision while she slept, and the arrangement they've struck will determine every remaining day of her life. The blacksmith's son, Henri, 26 years old, with calloused hands and a reputation for drink, has agreed to take her as wife. The dowry has been negotiated, the church has been consulted, and Marguerite's opinion has been neither sought nor considered relevant. She learns of her engagement not through gentle conversation or family discussion, but through the sudden flurry of activity that overtakes the household. Her mother begins sorting through their meagre possessions, deciding what few items might accompany Marguerite to her new home. A wooden spoon carved by her grandfather, a length of wool cloth she helped weave, perhaps a clay pot if they can spare it. These objects, humble as they are, represent the entirety of her inheritance, the sum total of what she will bring to her marriage beyond her own small body, and whatever skills her brief childhood has managed to teach her. The wedding preparations unfold around her like a fever dream. There's no joy in them, no celebration of love or partnership. Instead, there's the grim efficiency of a business transaction being finalized. Her mother teaches her what she can about the duties of a wife, speaking in hushed, urgent whispers about things that make Marguerite's cheeks burn with embarrassment and fear. The marriage bed, the importance of obedience, the absolute necessity of bearing sons quickly and frequently. These conversations happen in shadows between other tasks, as if the very words themselves are somehow shameful. Medieval marriage, you see, was not a union of equals embarking on a shared journey. It was the legal transfer of a woman from one man's authority to another's. The wedding ceremony itself reflected this stark reality. Marguerite's father would literally hand her over to Henri, symbolically passing ownership like a merchant delivering goods to a customer. She would promise to love, honor, and obey, while Henri would promise only to provide for her material needs. The inequality was built into the very words they would speak before God and community. But let's pause here. In these last days before Marguerite's childhood ends forever, and consider what she's leaving behind. Not much, by our standards, but everything by hers. The familiar rhythm of her mother's daily routine, the comfort of sleeping beside her younger sister, the small freedoms that came with being nobody's particular responsibility. Once married, every moment of her life would be accountable to someone else. Her time, her body, her thoughts, all would belong to her husband, to direct as he saw fit. The medieval world offered no concept of marital rape, no understanding that a woman might have the right to refuse her husband's demands. The church taught that wives owed their husbands absolute obedience in all things, and the law backed up this teaching with the full force of social order. A husband could beat his wife, provided he didn't kill her. He could confine her to the house, control whom she spoke with, decide whether she ate or went hungry. These weren't abuses of the system, they were features of it. On the morning of her wedding, Marguerite wakes before dawn, her stomach churning with dread and uncertainty. Her mother helps her into her best dress, a rough wool garment dyed brown with walnut husks, cleaned and mended for the occasion. There are no flowers in her hair, no veil of fine lace, no celebration of her beauty or joy. Instead, there's the practical business of making her presentable for transfer to her new owner. Her hair is braided severely back, her face scrubbed clean, her hands inspected for cleanliness. She looks, her mother notes with satisfaction, like a properly raised girl who will reflect well on her family's instruction. The ceremony itself is brief, conducted in Latin that Marguerite doesn't understand, surrounded by villagers who view the proceedings with the same interest they might show for any other commercial transaction. Henri stands beside her, smelling of ale and sweat, occasionally glancing at her as if taking inventory of his new acquisition. When the priest asks for her consent, her whispered "yes" is barely audible, more a sound of defeat than agreement. But it's enough. The deed is done. The feast that follows is modest but raucous, the men drinking heavily while the women serve and clean. Marguerite sits beside her new husband, picking at her food while conversation swirls around her. The men joke about the wedding night with crude humor that makes her want to disappear into the ground. The women offer advice in the form of warnings. Keep him fed, keep him satisfied, bear sons quickly, and never, ever give him cause to regret his choice. Their words carry the weight of hard-won experience, the accumulated wisdom of generations of women who learned these lessons through suffering. As evening approaches, the terrible reality of her situation becomes impossible to ignore. She will go home tonight, but not to her childhood bed beside her sister. She will go to Henri's house, to Henri's bed, to begin her new life as Henri's wife. The transition happens with shocking abruptness. One moment she's a girl helping her mother clear the feast table. The next she's walking through the village darkness toward a house that smells of unfamiliar cooking, unfamiliar bodies, unfamiliar fears. Henri's home is smaller than her father's, darker, with a single room that serves as kitchen, parlour, and bedchamber all at once. There's no privacy, No gentle transition into married life. The marriage must be consummated immediately, both for legal reasons and to establish Henri's authority over his new property. What happens next unfolds in darkness and silence, a brutal introduction to the physical realities of being a medieval wife. Marguerite endures it as countless women before her have endured it, by retreating somewhere deep inside herself, where the pain and humiliation cannot quite reach. The days that follow blur together in a haze of new routines and harsh realities. She rises before dawn to tend the fire, prepare Henri's breakfast, and begin the endless round of tasks that will fill her days. Cooking, cleaning, mending, spinning, tending the small garden behind the house. Her hands, once soft from childhood, quickly become rough and calloused. Her back aches from bending over the wash basin, the cooking pot, the spinning wheel. She discovers that marriage, far from providing the security her parents promised, has simply traded one form of uncertainty for another. Henri is not cruel by medieval standards, which is to say he only strikes her when she displeases him, and his displeasure is both frequent and unpredictable. She learns to read his moods like a sailor reads the weather, watching for the signs that might herald a storm. The set of his shoulders when he returns from work, the tone of his voice when he asks for his evening meal, the amount of ale he consumes before bed. Each day requires constant vigilance, constant adjustment, constant submission to a will that may change as suddenly as wind direction. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of Marguerite's new life is how completely it isolates her from the relationships that once sustained her. She sees her mother only at market days, and then only briefly, with Henri's permission and under his watchful eye. Her childhood friendships fade away as the demands of married life consume every hour. She has no confidants now except the other wives in the village, and their conversations are necessarily guarded, focused on practical matters rather than feelings or fears. To complain about one's husband, even to another woman, is to risk having those words reported back, with consequences that might be severe. The months pass, and with them comes the pressure that defines every medieval marriage, the desperate need to prove fertile. A wife who cannot produce children, particularly sons, is worse than useless. She's a burden, a mouth to feed with no compensating value. Marguerite knows this, feels the weight of expectation growing heavier with each passing month. Henri's growing impatience manifests in sharper words, harder looks, and an increasing tendency to blame her for their lack of offspring. The village women offer advice, potions made from strange herbs, prayers to saints who supposedly aid conception. But month after month, her courses continue to come, each one a small death of hope and safety. When pregnancy finally arrives, it brings not relief, but a new category of terror. Medieval childbirth was, quite literally, a matter of life and death. With no understanding of hygiene, no effective pain relief, and no medical intervention available for complications, women faced each pregnancy knowing it might be their last experience on earth. Marguerite watches her belly swell with a mixture of hope and dread, knowing that the child growing inside her represents both her salvation and possibly her doom. The local midwife, an elderly woman whose own survival of multiple births has given her an almost mystical status in the village, examines Marguerite with hands that have delivered hundreds of babies and closed the eyes of dozens of mothers who didn't survive the process. Her pronouncements are cryptic, couched in the superstitions and folk wisdom that pass for medical knowledge in this age of ignorance. The baby sits well, she declares, but birth is always a battle between life and death, and no one can predict which will emerge victorious. As her time approaches, Marguerite finds herself caught between competing fears. The fear of death in childbirth, yes, but also the fear of surviving but delivering a daughter instead of the son that Henri and his family desperately want. A daughter would be seen as a failure, a waste of the resources invested in pregnancy and birth. It would mean starting over, trying again, risking death again, all for the chance to produce the male heir that would secure her position and Henry's legacy. The labour, when it comes, unfolds in the familiar pattern of medieval birth. Pain beyond description, attended by women whose primary qualification is simply having survived similar experiences themselves. No doctors, no instruments beyond rough tools for cutting the cord, no understanding of the biological processes involved. Just women helping women through an ordeal that has claimed countless lives throughout history. Marguerite survives, barely, and delivers a son. The relief in the room is palpable, not just for the successful birth, but for the gender of the child. She has fulfilled her primary purpose, justified her existence, earned at least temporary security in Henri's household. But even in this moment of triumph, she understands that this is only the beginning. One son is not enough. She must produce more, preferably several more, to account for the high rates of infant mortality and to ensure Henri's line continues. The child, named Pierre after Henri's father, becomes the centre of Marguerite's world in ways both beautiful and terrifying. Her love for him is fierce and immediate, but it's tempered by the constant awareness that his survival depends on factors entirely beyond her control. Disease could claim him overnight. An accident could steal him in an instant. Or he might simply fade away like so many medieval children, victim to malnutrition, infection, or any of the dozens of ailments that modern medicine treats routinely, but medieval mothers could only pray against. Meanwhile, the demands of daily life continue unabated. The child must be fed, but so must Henri. The house must be cleaned, the garden tended, the countless tasks of survival completed each day, whether she feels strong enough or not. There's no maternity leave in medieval marriage, no period of rest and recovery. Within days of giving birth, Marguerite is back to her full routine of household management, now with an infant to care for as well. The isolation of her life deepens with motherhood. Henri expects her attention to remain focused on his needs despite the baby's demands. The other village women are too busy with their own struggles to provide much support. She finds herself trapped in a cycle of constant work, constant worry, constant exhaustion that seems to stretch endlessly ahead of her. And still, the story is far from over. Pierre is just her first child, and medieval women were expected to bear children regularly throughout their fertile years. Each pregnancy would bring the same risks, the same fears, the same desperate hope for survival. Each birth would roll the dice again with death, and eventually, statistics suggested, death would win. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, let's leave Marguerite in these early days of motherhood, holding her son close while Henri snores beside her, listening to the night sounds of the village and wondering what tomorrow will bring. The fire burns low in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and somewhere in those shadows lie all the challenges yet to come. The baby stirs in her arms, and she whispers a prayer for his safety, her voice barely audible above the crackling of dying embers. Tomorrow will bring its own trials, its own small battles for survival. But tonight, for just a moment, there's peace in the darkness. A mother's love wrapping around her child like armor against a world that offers precious little protection for either of them. The seasons turn with relentless indifference, and with each passing year, Marguerite discovers new depths to the challenges that define a medieval woman's existence. Little Pierre has survived his first winter, a small miracle in itself, but his survival only marks the beginning of fresh anxieties. For in this world where death stalks every doorway, where disease spreads through villages like wildfire, a mother's vigilance can never rest. She watches him constantly now, this precious child who represents both her greatest joy and her most vulnerable point. Every cough sends her heart racing. Every fever becomes a crisis that might steal away not just her son, but her entire reason for existing in Henri's household. The village has already seen 3 children claimed by the sweating sickness this winter, their small bodies laid to rest in the frozen ground while their mothers wailed behind veils of grief. Marguerite knows that her own security, her very survival, hangs on keeping this small life burning bright in a world determined to snuff it out. But Pierre's survival brings its own burdens. He's a hungry child, demanding milk that sometimes doesn't come when her own body is weakened by poor nutrition and endless labor. Medieval mothers had no understanding of the delicate balance between their own health and their ability to nourish their children. They simply endured, giving whatever they could, often at the cost of their own strength and well-being. Marguerite finds herself growing thinner even as Pierre grows stronger, her body sacrificing itself to sustain the life she's brought into the world. The other women in the village watch this drama unfold, with a mixture of sympathy and resignation. They've all walked this path themselves, these wives and mothers, whose faces bear the premature lines of constant worry. They share what wisdom they can, passed down through generations of women who learned through loss and suffering. "Keep the child warm," they whisper. "Don't let him play near the well. Watch for the signs of fever. Feed him honey if you can get it." Their advice carries the weight of hard experience, each suggestion born from some earlier tragedy, some lesson written in a mother's tears. Henri, meanwhile, begins to show the first signs of impatience for a second child. In his mind, one son is barely adequate protection against the uncertainties of medieval life. What if Pierre sickens? What if he suffers an accident? What if he proves unsuitable for inheriting the small plot of land and modest trade that represent Henri's legacy? These thoughts drive him to increase his demands on Marguerite, to pressure her for another pregnancy before her body has fully recovered from the first. The medieval understanding of women's bodies was primitive at best, shaped more by superstition than knowledge. There was no concept of allowing time for healing, no understanding that consecutive pregnancies might weaken a woman beyond recovery. Instead, there was only the relentless pressure to produce offspring, to justify one's existence through fertility, to prove one's worth through the ability to bear and raise children who might survive to adulthood. When Marguerite's second pregnancy arrives, it brings with it a familiar cocktail of hope and terror. She's older now, though still barely 15 by our reckoning, and the accumulated stress of her life has already begun to mark her face with lines that speak of worry and sleepless nights. This pregnancy feels different from the first, harder somehow, as if her body is rebelling against the demands placed upon it. The morning sickness lasts longer, the fatigue cuts deeper, and the swelling in her hands and feet begins earlier than she remembers from carrying Pierre. The village midwife examines her with those experienced hands and frowns slightly, though she keeps her concerns to herself. There's no point in frightening the girl more than necessary, and besides, what would be gained by voicing fears that no one has the power to address? Medieval medicine had no solutions for complicated pregnancies, no interventions for dangerous conditions. There was only prayer, hope, and the grim acceptance that some women would pay the ultimate price for bringing life into the world. As her belly swells, Marguerite finds herself struggling with tasks that once seemed manageable. Carrying water from the well becomes an ordeal. Bending to tend the fire sends shooting pains through her back. Even caring for Pierre becomes more challenging as her energy flags and her body rebels against the constant demands placed upon it. Yet there's no respite available, no understanding that pregnancy might require rest or reduced responsibilities. The work of survival continues regardless of her condition, and Henri's expectations remain unchanged. The other wives watch her growing struggle with knowing looks. They remember their own difficult pregnancies, the ones that nearly killed them, the ones that did kill friends and sisters and daughters. They help when they can, taking turns watching Pierre when Marguerite needs to rest, sharing food when her appetite fails, offering the quiet companionship that women have always provided each other in times of trial. But their help must be given carefully, secretly, for too much assistance might suggest to the men that their wives are shirking their own duties. This second pregnancy also brings with it the crushing weight of expectation for another son. One boy is good, but two would be better. Insurance against the countless ways that medieval childhood can end in tragedy. Marguerite finds herself praying desperately for a male child, knowing that delivering a daughter would be seen as a failure, a waste of the suffering and risk involved in pregnancy and birth. The pressure is enormous, the stakes impossibly high, and the outcome entirely beyond her control. The birth, when it comes, is harder than the first. Longer, more painful, with complications that the midwife tries to hide behind reassuring words and confident actions. But Marguerite can read the worry in the older woman's eyes, can sense the tension that fills the small room where she labours through the long night. Something is wrong, though no one will say what. And she finds herself caught between the immediate agony of childbirth and the growing fear that this ordeal might not end in joy. When dawn finally breaks, it brings with it a daughter, a healthy, beautiful girl who cries lustily and nurses eagerly, but whose gender represents a profound disappointment to everyone except her mother. Henry's face, when he learns the news, tells the whole story. His expression shifting from hope to resignation to something approaching anger. Another mouth to feed, another dowry to save for, another burden on the household's limited resources. The midwife tries to offer consolation, pointing out the child's obvious health and vigour, but everyone understands that this birth has failed to meet expectations. Marguerite holds her new daughter, whom she names Marie after her own mother, and feels a complex mixture of love and guilt. She adores this small being immediately, completely, but she also knows that Marie's existence represents a kind of failure in the eyes of their world. A daughter cannot inherit land, cannot carry on the family name, cannot provide the security that sons represent. Marie will need to be fed, clothed, and protected until she can be married off, at which point she'll become another family's responsibility rather than an asset to her birth family. The recovery from this birth is slower, more difficult than the first. Something has been damaged in the process, some essential strength sapped that doesn't return as quickly as before. Marguerite finds herself weakened in ways that go beyond normal post-birth fatigue. Simple tasks leave her breathless. Her milk comes less easily, requiring constant effort to maintain. The constant ache in her back suggests that the physical toll of this pregnancy has been more severe than she initially realised. Meanwhile, the demands of caring for two small children while managing a household prove overwhelming. Pierre, now a toddler, requires constant supervision to keep him from the dozen dangers that lurk around every medieval home. The fire pit, the well, the animals, the tools, all represent potential disasters that only a mother's vigilance can prevent. Little Marie needs feeding every few hours, changing when the precious scraps of cloth that serve as diapers become soiled, and the constant attention that keeps infants thriving in a world without modern conveniences. Henry's patience with the situation grows thin quickly. He sees his wife struggling, his household less efficiently managed, his meals less punctually prepared, and he interprets these changes as signs of laziness rather than necessity. The medieval world had no understanding of the physical and emotional demands of caring for multiple young children, no recognition that even the strongest woman might be overwhelmed by such responsibilities. There was only the expectation that wives would manage everything perfectly, regardless of circumstances. The village women try to help when they can, but their own lives are equally demanding, equally constrained by the needs of their households and the expectations of their husbands. They might watch one of Marguerite's children for an hour while she completes some urgent task, or share a pot of stew when her own cooking falls behind schedule. But these gestures of support must be carefully balanced against their own survival needs. In a world of scarcity, even kindness has limits. As the months pass, it becomes clear that something fundamental has changed in Marguerite's life. The second birth has aged her in ways that go beyond the simple passage of time. Her face has acquired a permanent expression of weariness. Her shoulders carry themselves differently, as if burdened by invisible weights. The girl who married Henri just 3 years earlier has been transformed into a woman marked by the relentless demands of medieval motherhood. Yet even as she struggles with these immediate challenges, the pressure for another pregnancy begins to build. Henri makes it clear that 2 children, especially with one being a daughter, are insufficient for his plans. He wants more sons, more insurance against the uncertainties of life, more proof of his virility and success. The fact that each pregnancy weakens Marguerite further, that each birth brings her closer to the edge of survival, doesn't factor into his calculations. In medieval thinking, women existed to bear children, and their personal well-being was secondary to that primary function. The approaching prospect of a third pregnancy fills Marguerite with a dread that she can barely acknowledge, even to herself. She's seen what repeated childbearing does to women's bodies, watched mothers in the village fade and fail, as one birth follows another, in relentless succession. She's attended the funerals of women who simply couldn't survive another delivery, who paid with their lives for the medieval demand for large families. Yet she also knows that refusing her husband's demands isn't an option, that her survival depends on continued fertility, that she has no choice but to hope her body can endure whatever lies ahead. The nights grow longer as autumn approaches, and Marguerite finds herself lying awake long after Henri's snores fill the small room. Pierre sleeps curled against her side, and Marie rests in the wooden cradle that Henri built with his own hands. These quiet moments, stolen from the constant demands of daylight, become precious to her, islands of peace in a life that offers little rest or comfort. She listens to the sounds of the village settling into sleep, the distant bark of a dog, the creak of timber as houses adjust to the cooling air. Somewhere out there, other women lie awake with similar fears, similar burdens, similar questions about what tomorrow might bring. They're connected by their shared experience of medieval womanhood, bound together by challenges that no amount of individual strength can fully overcome. The fire burns low in the hearth, casting shifting shadows that dance across the walls like memories of all the women who came before, all those who faced these same struggles and somehow found the strength to continue. Their stories live on in the survival of their children, in the persistence of their bloodlines, in the quiet courage that allowed them to face each new day, despite knowing how little control they had over their own destinies. Tomorrow will bring its own trials, its own small battles for survival. But tonight, in the gathering darkness, there's a moment of stillness, a brief respite from the relentless demands of medieval life. Marguerite closes her eyes and whispers a prayer for her children's safety, for her own strength, for the wisdom to navigate whatever challenges lie ahead in a world that offers women so few paths to security or peace. The embers glow softly in the darkness, and somewhere in that gentle light lies all the uncertainty and hope that define a medieval woman's existence. The seasons turn with their ancient rhythm, and Marguerite finds herself caught in patterns as old as time itself. Her third pregnancy arrives like an unwelcome guest, bringing with it a bone-deep exhaustion that seems to seep into her very soul. She's barely 19 now, though the woman who stares back from the polished metal that serves as a mirror looks decades older. Her face has acquired the hollow cheeks and shadowed eyes that mark so many village women, the physical signature of lives spent giving more than their bodies could sustainably offer. This pregnancy feels different from the others, more dangerous somehow, as if her body is finally beginning to rebel against the endless cycle of conception, birth, and recovery that defines medieval womanhood. The morning sickness comes with a vengeance, leaving her retching into the slop bucket, while Pierre tugs at her skirts and baby Marie cries from her cradle. There are days when she can barely keep water down, let alone the meager meals that represent her family's survival. The village midwife examines her with hands that have grown increasingly gentle over the years, as if she senses something fragile in this young woman who has already given so much. Her pronouncements grow more cautious, her advice more urgent. "Rest when you can," she whispers, though they both know rest is a luxury that medieval mothers cannot afford. "Eat whatever you can stomach," she advises, though food is often scarce and Henry's needs take precedence. The older woman's eyes carry knowledge that she cannot share, understanding born of watching too many young mothers fade away like candle flames guttering in the wind. The physical demands of this pregnancy are compounded by the growing needs of her existing children. Pierre, now a sturdy 3-year-old, has developed the fearless curiosity that makes toddlers so dangerous to themselves. He's drawn to the fire pit like a moth to flame, fascinated by the sharp tools Henri uses in his work, capable of disappearing in the few seconds when Marguerite's attention turns to his sister. Watching him requires constant vigilance, the kind of energy that pregnancy seems determined to steal away. Little Marie, meanwhile, has begun the slow process of weaning, a transition that brings its own challenges in a world without adequate substitutes for mother's milk. The thin gruel made from barley and water that passes for infant food often causes more harm than good, leaving children with swollen bellies and wasted limbs. Marguerite finds herself torn between the need to continue nursing, which drains her already depleted strength, and the necessity of preparing Marie for independence before the new baby arrives. The other women in the village watch this familiar drama unfold with expressions that mix sympathy with resignation. They've all walked this path themselves, these mothers who understand the arithmetic of medieval survival. Some children live, others don't. Some mothers survive childbirth, others become cautionary tales whispered around evening fires. The lucky ones endure long enough to see their children grown and married, to hold grandchildren in arms marked by decades of labour and loss. But luck, in the medieval world, is a commodity in short supply, especially for women. Marguerite discovers this truth in small ways each day, as her body struggles to meet demands that seem to multiply like spring weeds. The simple act of drawing water from the well becomes an ordeal that leaves her gasping for breath. Preparing meals requires frequent rests as waves of dizziness threaten to send her sprawling. Even sleeping becomes difficult as the growing child shifts and presses against organs already strained by previous pregnancies. Henri watches these developments with increasing frustration. In his understanding of the world, pregnancy should make women more docile, more focused on domestic duties, not less capable of managing household responsibilities. When meals are late or poorly prepared, when children's cries wake him from sleep, when the house falls short of his expectations for cleanliness and order, he responds with the casual violence that medieval law not only permitted but encouraged. A husband's right to discipline his wife was as fundamental as his right to own property, and the bruises that bloom across Marguerite's arms serve as reminders of her failures to meet his standards. The isolation that comes with repeated pregnancy and childbirth grows more pronounced with each passing month. The other village women are too busy with their own struggles to provide much support, and besides, helping a neighbour too much might suggest to their own husbands that they have time and energy to spare. Marguerite finds herself increasingly alone with her fears, her pain, and her growing certainty that this pregnancy will test her limits in ways the others did not. The winter months bring additional challenges as food stores dwindle and the cold seeps through the gaps in their modest homes' walls. Medieval houses offered little protection against the elements, and pregnant women were particularly vulnerable to the respiratory ailments that swept through communities during the harsh months. Marguerite develops a cough that seems to settle deep in her chest, a persistent reminder of her body's weakened state. The baby moves less frequently now, as if it too understands the precarious nature of their situation. When the labour finally begins, it arrives not with the sudden urgency of her previous births, but with a slow, grinding persistence that speaks of complications the midwife cannot name, but clearly recognises. The older woman's face grows increasingly grave as the hours pass without progress. as Marguerite's strength ebbs like water from a cracked vessel. There are whispered conferences with the other women who have gathered to help, conversations conducted in the corner shadows, where their words cannot add to the labouring mother's fears. The birth, when it finally occurs, comes at a cost that will mark Marguerite for the rest of her life. Something tears inside her that will never properly heal, some essential structure damaged beyond repair. The child, another son they named Thomas, arrives weak and struggling, his cries more like whispers than the lusty protests that had announced his siblings' arrivals. The midwife works with practiced efficiency to clear his airways and encourage his breathing, but her expression suggests that this child's hold on life is as tenuous as his mother's. The recovery period stretches into weeks, then months, as Marguerite slowly comes to terms with what this birth has cost her. The bleeding that should have stopped continues intermittently, a reminder of internal injuries that medieval medicine cannot address. The pain that should have faded becomes a constant companion, a dull ache that intensifies with movement and never entirely disappears. Most troubling of all, her milk comes poorly, leaving little Thomas weak and fretful while she struggles to find alternative sources of nourishment. The household begins to show signs of strain as Marguerite's ability to manage daily tasks continues to decline. Meals become simpler and less regular. The children's clothes go longer between washings. The small garden behind the house, once her pride, becomes overgrown with weeds. Henri's patience, never abundant, wears increasingly thin as he finds himself managing responsibilities he considers beneath his dignity as a man. The village women try to help when they can, but their assistance must be carefully managed to avoid suggesting that Henri cannot provide adequately for his family. They bring occasional pots of stew, claiming to have cooked too much for their own households. They watch the children for brief periods, explaining that they enjoy the company. They share their knowledge of herbal remedies, though everyone understands that some injuries go too deep for plant-based healing. As spring arrives and Marguerite slowly regains some measure of strength, she begins to understand that her life has entered a new phase, one marked by limitations she had never imagined. The easy pregnancies and quick recoveries of her early motherhood are clearly behind her. Her body has been fundamentally changed by the demands placed upon it, aged beyond her years by the relentless cycle of conception, pregnancy, birth, and barely adequate recovery. Yet even as she grapples with these physical realities, the pressure for additional children continues to mount. Henri makes it clear that 3 children, even 3 sons, are insufficient insurance against the uncertainties of medieval life. He wants more offspring, more proof of his virility, more hands to help with the work that will secure their family's survival. The fact that each pregnancy now threatens Marguerite's life doesn't factor into his calculations any more than the weather factors into the sun's decision to rise each morning. The other village women understand her situation with the wordless recognition that comes from shared experience. They've all known mothers who couldn't survive another birth, who paid with their lives for medieval society's demand for large families. They've attended funerals where husbands remarried within months, not from callousness, but from necessity, because households required women to function and children needed mothers to survive. Marguerite finds herself caught between competing forms of danger. Pregnancy threatens her life, but refusing Henri's demands threatens her security. A wife who cannot or will not bear children becomes expendable, a burden rather than an asset. Medieval law and custom provided numerous ways for men to rid themselves of inconvenient wives, from simple abandonment to more formal processes that could leave a woman destitute and homeless. The summer passes quietly as she tends to her 3 children and tries to regain enough strength to face whatever the future might hold. Little Thomas remains weak and sickly, requiring constant attention that she can barely provide. Pierre has grown into a sturdy child, but one whose boundless energy exhausts his already depleted mother. Marie shows signs of the quick intelligence that might serve her well in adult life, if she survives the dangerous passage from childhood to marriageable age. The evening hours, when the children are finally asleep and Henri has settled into his ale-induced stupor, become precious to Marguerite. She sits by the dying fire and contemplates the narrow path her life has taken, the limited options that define every medieval woman's existence. There are no alternatives to consider, no different futures to imagine. There is only the hope that she can survive whatever lies ahead, that her children will grow strong enough to face their own challenges, that somehow the small flame of her life will continue burning despite all the forces aligned against it. The nights grow longer as autumn approaches, and with them comes the familiar dread of another winter, another season of scarcity and cold, and the constant battle for survival that defines peasant life. But there's something else approaching too, something that Marguerite can sense, even though she cannot yet name it. Her body, stretched beyond its limits by repeated childbearing, is beginning to send signals that she's reluctant to interpret. The cycle is beginning again, whether she's ready for it or not. Another pregnancy looms on the horizon like a storm cloud, dark with possibility and heavy with threat. She knows now what each birth costs, understands the arithmetic of survival that governs medieval women's lives. She also knows that she has no choice but to face whatever comes, to endure whatever must be endured, to hope that this time her luck will hold just a little longer. The fire crackles softly in the darkness, and somewhere in its dancing light lies all the uncertainty and courage that define a woman's existence in these harsh and unforgiving times. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, its own small battles for survival. But tonight, for just a moment, there's stillness in the shadows, a brief respite from the relentless demands of medieval life. A quiet space where even the most burdened soul can find a moment's peace. The flames flicker lower now, casting longer shadows across the walls of countless medieval homes where women like Marguerite face the approaching darkness with quiet resignation. As autumn deepens into winter, her worst fears begin to manifest in ways both subtle and undeniable. The familiar signs appear like unwelcome visitors. The missed monthly courses, the morning queasiness that sends her stumbling from bed to retch into the chamber pot, the telltale tenderness that speaks of new life taking root in a body already strained beyond its natural limits. This fourth pregnancy arrives like a sentence passed down by an indifferent judge, carrying with it the accumulated weight of all her previous ordeals. Marguerite's body, now barely 21 years old, but bearing the accumulated damage of multiple births, seems to rebel against this fresh demand upon its resources. The exhaustion that settles over her is profound, bone deep, the kind of weariness that sleep cannot cure and rest cannot alleviate. The village midwife, when consulted in whispered conversations behind closed doors, can offer little comfort beyond grim acknowledgement of the obvious. This woman who has attended hundreds of births, who has closed the eyes of dozens of mothers who couldn't survive the process, recognizes the signs that speak of danger ahead. But medieval medicine offers no alternatives, no interventions, no solutions beyond prayer, and the slim hope that somehow this time might be different. Henri's reaction to news of the pregnancy reveals the casual indifference with which medieval men regarded their wives' suffering. He expresses satisfaction at the prospect of another child, another potential heir, without any acknowledgement of what this pregnancy might cost the woman carrying it. To him, Marguerite's growing weakness is simply an inconvenience, her increasing inability to manage household tasks a personal failing rather than a consequence of physical exhaustion. The children, too young to understand their mother's condition, but old enough to sense the change in household atmosphere, respond with the confusion and neediness that make her burden even heavier. Pierre, now approaching his 5th year, has developed the demanding nature of a child accustomed to maternal attention that increasingly must be rationed. Marie, still a toddler herself, clings to her mother's skirts with desperate intensity, as if she senses that the source of her security might be slipping away, and little Thomas, weak since birth and requiring constant care, seems to drain whatever reserves of energy Marguerite might otherwise have conserved. The physical symptoms of this pregnancy prove more severe than any she has previously endured. The morning sickness extends well into the afternoon and evening, leaving her unable to keep down even the simplest foods. The swelling in her hands and feet begins early and progresses rapidly, making it difficult to grip tools or walk without pain. Most concerning of all, the bleeding that never properly stopped after Thomas's birth seems to worsen, a bright red reminder of internal damage that grows more dangerous with each passing week. Other women in the village, observing Marguerite's obvious distress, begin to speak in the coded language that medieval communities used to discuss uncomfortable truths. They murmur about women who couldn't carry another, about mothers who gave too much, about the mysterious ways that God called some souls home while their children were still small. These conversations, conducted in whispers while men are absent, serve as both warning and comfort, acknowledgement of shared vulnerability in a world that offered women little protection against the consequences of their biological destiny. The work of daily survival continues regardless of Marguerite's condition, because medieval households had no mechanism for accommodating maternal weakness or pregnancy complications. Water must still be carried from the well, despite the dizziness that threatens to send her tumbling into its depths. Meals must still be prepared, though the smell of cooking food often sends her fleeing to empty her already empty stomach. Children must still be watched, clothed, and comforted, even when she can barely summon the energy to care for her own basic needs. The winter months bring additional hardships as the family's food stores dwindle and the cold penetrates every corner of their modest dwelling. Marguerite finds herself caught in a cruel paradox. Her body desperately needs nourishment to support both herself and the growing child, but the limited food available must first feed Henri and the existing children. She learns to subsist on scraps and leftovers, to find sustenance in potato peelings and thin broths made from bones boiled until they surrender their last traces of nutrition. The pregnancy progresses with an ominous quality that even Marguerite, for all her limited medical knowledge, recognizes as dangerous. The child seems to move less frequently than her others had, and when movement does occur, it brings waves of pain that leave her gasping and clutching at walls for support. The midwife's examinations grow more frequent and more concerned, though the older woman maintains the careful optimism that medieval birthing attendants learned to project even when privately fearing the worst. Sleep becomes elusive as the pregnancy advances, not merely because of physical discomfort, but because of the dreams that plague her rest. Nightmares filled with blood and darkness, visions of children crying for mothers who will never answer, phantoms of village women who died in childbed while their families watched helplessly from doorways they could no longer cross. These dreams feel less like products of an anxious mind and more like glimpses of a future that grows more probable with each passing night. The social isolation that defines so much of medieval women's experience intensifies during this difficult pregnancy. The other village wives, bound by their own survival needs and their husbands' expectations, can offer only limited support. A bowl of soup shared when no one is looking, a brief respite from child-watching duties, words of encouragement whispered during chance encounters at the market. These gestures, small as they are, become lifelines in a world where asking for help too directly might be interpreted as weakness or failure. Henri's patience with his wife's condition wears increasingly thin as the months progress. He sees her growing inability to manage household tasks as evidence of laziness or rebellion rather than physical incapacity. When meals are late or poorly prepared, when children's needs go unmet, when the house falls short of his standards for cleanliness and order, he responds with the casual violence that medieval society not only tolerated, but actively encouraged. The The bruises that mark Marguerite's arms and shoulders become as much a part of her daily reality as the ache in her back or the constant nausea that makes each day an endurance test. The approaching birth looms like a storm on the horizon, dark with possibilities that no one dares voice aloud. The midwife begins making subtle preparations, gathering the herbs and cloths that might be needed, sending quiet messages to other women who might assist when the time comes. But these preparations carry an undertone of finality, as if everyone involved understands that this birth will mark some kind of ending, though whether of suffering or of life itself remains unclear. Spring arrives with its usual promises of renewal and hope, but for Marguerite, the changing season brings only the knowledge that her ordeal is approaching its climax. The child has grown heavy within her, pressing against organs already damaged by previous births, making each breath a conscious effort and each step a carefully calculated risk. She moves through her days like a ghost haunting her own life, present but increasingly detached from the world around her. The final weeks of pregnancy pass in a haze of pain and exhaustion, punctuated by moments of startling clarity when she understands exactly what lies ahead. She begins to speak more frequently to her children, trying to impart whatever wisdom a woman barely past 20 can offer to souls who will likely grow up without her guidance. She teaches Marie the songs her own mother sang, shows Pierre how to comfort his baby brother, whispers prayers over Thomas that might protect him when she no longer can. These conversations take place in stolen moments when Henri is absent, brief interludes of maternal love carved out from days otherwise consumed by the business of survival. She knows instinctively that her husband would disapprove of such emotional displays, would see them as evidence of morbid thinking or dangerous self-indulgence. Medieval men, after all, expected their wives to approach childbirth with stoic acceptance, to view the risk of death as simply another aspect of feminine duty. The labour, when it finally begins, arrives not with the familiar rhythms of her previous births, but with an intensity that immediately signals disaster. The pain is different this time, sharper and more persistent, speaking of complications that the village midwife recognises but cannot address. The women who gather to assist speak in hushed tones, their faces grave with understanding of what they are witnessing. Hours pass without progress, then more hours, as Marguerite's strength ebbs like water from a cracked vessel. The child seems reluctant to enter a world that offers so little comfort, while the mother lacks the physical resources necessary to complete the journey from pregnancy to birth. The midwife works with practiced skill, but her tools are limited and her knowledge bounded by centuries of superstition and ignorance. The other women take turns offering what comfort they can, holding Marguerite's hands, wiping her face with cool cloths, whispering encouragements that sound increasingly hollow as the situation deteriorates. They've all attended births like this before, watched other young mothers slip away while their children waited in adjoining rooms, unaware that their world was ending just beyond thin wooden walls. As dawn breaks over the village, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that mock the darkness unfolding within the modest house, it becomes clear that this birth will extract a price higher than any previously paid. The midwife's face tells the story before her words do, her expression shifting from professional concern to the resigned sadness of someone who has witnessed this tragedy too many times before. The child, when finally born, enters the world silently, too weak to cry, too damaged by the prolonged labour to draw the breath necessary for life. The son that Henri had anticipated, the heir he had demanded, lives only long enough to be baptized with water from the holy well, to receive a name that will be carved into no stone and remembered by no songs. And Marguerite, the young woman who began this story as a child herself, follows her son into whatever realm awaits those who have given everything and found it insufficient. Her last conscious moments are spent looking toward the corner where her surviving children huddle together, confusion and fear written across faces too young to understand the finality of what they are witnessing. The silence that follows is profound, broken only by the soft weeping of women who have lost another sister to the brutal mathematics of medieval motherhood. They will prepare the bodies with gentle hands, speak the prayers that custom demands, and then return to their own homes where similar fates await, inevitable as sunrise, certain as winter's return. Henri's reaction to his wife's death reveals the pragmatic callousness that medieval survival required. Within days of the funeral, he begins making inquiries about remarriage, not from lack of feeling, but from necessity. Households required women to function, children needed mothers to survive, and emotional grieving was a luxury that peasant life could not accommodate. The children, orphaned by a system that demanded more than bodies could give, face uncertain futures that will be shaped by stepmothers' moods, fathers' patience, and the grudging charity of relatives who have their own survival to consider. They will grow up carrying the legacy of their mother's sacrifice, inheriting a world where women's lives are measured not in happiness or fulfillment, but in their capacity to endure suffering for others' benefit. As night falls over the village and families gather around their hearths for evening meals, Marguerite's story fades into the collective memory of women's experiences, becoming part of the whispered warnings that mothers pass to daughters, the coded conversations that acknowledge truths too dangerous to speak aloud. She joins the countless other medieval women whose names history never recorded, but whose sacrifices made possible the continuation of human life under conditions that seem almost unimaginably harsh. The fire burns low in hearths across the village, casting shadows that dance like memories of all the women who came before, all those who faced similar challenges and paid similar prices. Their stories live on in the survival of their children, in the persistence of bloodlines that carry forward despite everything, in the quiet courage that allowed them to face each new day, knowing how little control they had over their destinies. Tomorrow will bring new challenges for the women who remain, new pregnancies that will test the limits of human endurance, new children who will need protection in a world that offers so little safety. The cycle continues, relentless as seasons, inevitable as death, sustained by the remarkable resilience of women who somehow find the strength to carry on, despite knowing the likely cost of their devotion. The embers glow softly in the darkness, and somewhere in that gentle light lies all the sorrow and strength that define medieval women's existence, all the love and loss that shape their brief passages through a world that demanded everything and offered so little in return. In the days that follow Marguerite's death, the village settles back into its familiar rhythms with the practiced indifference that medieval communities had learned to adopt in the face of recurring tragedy. The women who attended her final hours returned to their own households, their own endless cycles of cooking and cleaning and child-minding, carrying with them the fresh reminder of what awaited them all. They speak of her in whispers when their husbands are absent, adding her name to the long litany of mothers who couldn't survive another birth, another pregnancy, another demand from bodies already stretched beyond endurance. But Marguerite's story, tragic as it was, represents only one thread in the vast tapestry of medieval women's suffering. To truly understand the brutality of their existence, we must step back and examine the broader patterns that shaped feminine life in these distant centuries. We must look beyond individual tragedy to see the systematic forces that made such tragedies not only possible, but inevitable. The medieval world was built on assumptions about women that seem almost incomprehensible today. From the moment a girl drew her first breath, she entered a society that had already determined her worth, mapped her future, and established the narrow boundaries within which her entire life would unfold. She was considered quite literally an incomplete man, a flawed version of masculine perfection, whose very existence represented divine punishment for humanity's original transgression. This wasn't merely social prejudice or cultural bias. It was theological doctrine, legal precedent, medical theory, and philosophical truth, all rolled into a comprehensive worldview that left no room for feminine agency or independence. The Church taught that women were inherently weak, morally compromised, and intellectually inferior. The law treated them as property to be transferred from father to husband to son. Medicine viewed their bodies as mysterious, dangerous, and fundamentally defective. Philosophy relegated them to the margins of human experience, important only for their biological functions. Consider the education available to medieval girls, or rather, the education systematically denied to them. While boys from wealthy families might be sent to cathedral schools or monastic institutions, girls were deliberately excluded from formal learning. The prevailing wisdom held that literacy was not only unnecessary for women, but actually dangerous. A woman who could read might encounter ideas that would make her dissatisfied with her prescribed role. She might begin to question the authority of her male guardians. She might even dare to think that her life could be different from the narrow path society had laid out for her. This educational apartheid had consequences that extended far beyond simple ignorance. It meant that women could not participate in the intellectual life of their time, could not contribute to theological debates or philosophical discussions, could not engage with the ideas that shaped their world. They were forced to experience life through the interpretations of others, to accept without question the explanations men provided for everything from natural phenomena to divine will. The few women who did manage to acquire literacy often did so in secret, learning from sympathetic relatives or clergy who understood the hunger for knowledge that burned in exceptional minds. But even these rare scholars faced enormous obstacles. They could not attend universities, could not join intellectual communities, could not publish their thoughts under their own names. Their ideas, if they managed to express them at all, were often attributed to male mentors, or dismissed as curiosities rather than serious contributions to human understanding. The medical understanding of women's bodies in medieval times was perhaps even more disturbing than their educational exclusion. Physicians, trained in ancient texts that viewed female anatomy as a corrupt version of male perfection, approached women's health with a combination of ignorance and contempt that proved deadly in countless cases. They believed that women's wombs wandered through their bodies like restless animals, causing hysteria and madness. They thought that menstruation was evidence of feminine corruption, that pregnancy was a form of divine punishment, that childbirth pain was necessary penance for Eve's original sin. These medical theories weren't abstract philosophical concepts. They translated into treatment practices that often made women's conditions worse rather than better. Bloodletting was prescribed for everything from difficult pregnancies to emotional distress. Dangerous herbs were administered without understanding their effects on developing fetuses. Women in labor were denied pain relief, not because it wasn't available, but because suffering was considered spiritually necessary. The result was a medical system that viewed women as medical puzzles rather than human beings, that prioritized theoretical purity over practical outcomes, that allowed countless women to die from conditions that might have been treatable with more compassionate and informed care. Marguerite's death, in other words, wasn't just personal tragedy. It was the predictable result of a medical establishment that had no real interest in keeping women alive once they had served their reproductive function. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of medieval women's oppression was how completely it was normalized, how thoroughly it was integrated into every aspect of daily life. The restrictions placed on women weren't seen as cruel or unjust. They were understood as natural law, as divine mandate, as the proper order of creation itself. Women who chafed against these limitations weren't viewed as victims of an unfair system. They were seen as dangerous rebels against God's will, threats to social stability, examples of feminine weakness and moral corruption. This normalization meant that women often participated in their own oppression, accepting and even enforcing the very restrictions that limited their lives. Mothers taught daughters to be submissive, to accept male authority without question, to find their only value in service to others. They did this not from cruelty, but from love, understanding that resistance would only bring suffering, while compliance might offer some small measure of security. The Church played a central role in maintaining this system of oppression, using its spiritual authority to sanctify social arrangements that benefited men at women's expense. Sunday sermons reminded congregations that feminine submission was divinely ordained, that questioning male authority was tantamount to questioning God himself. Religious festivals celebrated female saints who had found holiness through suffering, who had achieved spiritual perfection by denying their own needs and desires. Even the Virgin Mary, the most revered woman in Christian theology, served as a model of perfect feminine behavior that was impossible for ordinary women to achieve. She was simultaneously virgin and mother, pure and fertile, submissive and powerful. Real women, struggling with the messy realities of medieval life, could never measure up to such an impossible standard. They were left feeling inadequate, sinful, forever falling short of divine expectations. The legal system reinforced these religious teachings with practical mechanisms that made feminine independence literally impossible. Women could not own property, could not make contracts, could not appear in court without male representation. They had no legal recourse against abusive husbands, no protection against rape or assault, no way to escape marriages that threatened their lives or sanity. The law treated them as perpetual children, incapable of making decisions about their own lives, forever requiring male guardianship and oversight. These legal restrictions weren't bugs in the medieval system. They were features, carefully designed to ensure that women remained dependent on male protection and authority. A woman who could support herself economically would have no incentive to marry. A woman who could defend herself legally would have no need for male advocacy. A woman who could make her own decisions would pose a fundamental threat to patriarchal social organization. The economic arrangements of medieval society further reinforced feminine dependence by systematically excluding women from profitable occupations and independent business ventures. While men could become merchants, craftsmen, scholars, or clergy, women were largely restricted to domestic service, agricultural labor, and the care of children and elderly relatives. Even when women did work outside the home, their wages were typically a fraction of what men earned for similar tasks, ensuring that they could never achieve true economic independence. This economic marginalization had profound effects on women's life choices and opportunities. A woman without independent income had no alternative to marriage, no matter how unsuitable or dangerous her potential husband might be. She could not choose to remain single, could not support herself through her own labor, could not leave an abusive relationship without facing destitution. Economic dependence became a tool of social control, ensuring that women remained trapped within systems that exploited and endangered them. The few economic opportunities available to women were often tied to their biological functions or traditional domestic skills. They might work as midwives, attending births and caring for new mothers, but their lack of formal medical training meant they could do little to address serious complications. They might serve as wet nurses, selling their breast milk to wealthy families, but this work often meant neglecting their own children's nutritional needs. They might take in laundry or sewing, but such piecework paid poorly and offered no security or advancement opportunities. Even women from wealthy families faced severe economic constraints, though their restrictions were gilded with luxury and social prestige. They might own beautiful clothes and live in comfortable houses, but they could not control the wealth that supported their lifestyle. Their fathers managed their inheritance until marriage. Their husbands controlled their dowries afterward. They lived as pampered prisoners, comfortable but powerless, protected but controlled. The social isolation that characterized so many medieval women's lives was both cause and consequence of their systematic oppression. Cut off from formal education, excluded from economic opportunities, legally dependent on male authority. They had few chances to form relationships with other women or to develop networks of mutual support. Their lives were centered on their immediate families, their social interactions limited to brief encounters at market or church. This isolation made it difficult for women to recognize the systemic nature of their oppression or to organize collective responses to their shared challenges. Each woman experienced her restrictions as personal limitations rather than social injustices, blamed herself for failing to thrive within systems designed to prevent her success. The few who did recognize the broader patterns of feminine oppression had no platforms from which to speak, no audiences prepared to listen, no mechanisms for creating change. The psychological toll of living under such comprehensive restrictions was enormous. Though medieval society had no vocabulary for discussing mental health or emotional well-being, women were expected to accept their limitations with grace and gratitude, to find fulfillment in service to others, to suppress any desires or ambitions that conflicted with their prescribed roles. Those who struggled with depression, anxiety, or other emotional challenges were often blamed for moral weakness or spiritual failing. The constant stress of living without agency, of facing daily dangers without protection, of watching children die from preventable causes, created levels of trauma that modern minds can barely comprehend. Yet medieval women were expected to bear these burdens without complaint, to maintain cheerful demeanor while their hearts broke, to project strength while their bodies failed. The emotional labor required for such performance was exhausting, adding another layer of suffering to lives already overwhelmed by physical hardship. Religious life offered some women an alternative to marriage and motherhood, but even convents and monasteries reflected the broader patterns of gender inequality that characterized medieval society. While male religious orders often engaged in scholarship, teaching, and intellectual pursuits, female religious communities were typically focused on prayer, contemplation, and domestic labor. Nuns might escape the dangers of childbirth, but they remained subject to male authority in the form of bishops, abbots, and other church officials. The few women who did achieve positions of religious authority often faced resistance from male colleagues who questioned their competence and authority. Female mystics and visionaries might gain temporary influence through claimed divine revelations, but their power was always precarious, dependent on male interpretation and approval of their spiritual experiences. Even the most successful religious women operated within systems that fundamentally limited their agency and independence. As winter deepens around the medieval villages where women like Marguerite once lived and died, we begin to understand the full scope of the challenges that defined feminine existence in these distant times. Their lives were shaped not by individual choices or personal failings, but by systematic oppression that touched every aspect of human experience. They faced restrictions that modern minds can barely comprehend, endured sufferings that contemporary medicine could easily prevent, and died from causes that proper social organization might have eliminated. Yet somehow, impossibly, they endured. They found ways to love their children despite knowing how easily those children might be lost. They created networks of mutual support despite social systems designed to isolate them. They preserved knowledge and traditions despite being excluded from formal education. They maintained hope despite facing seemingly hopeless circumstances. Their strength was not the romanticized resilience that modern observers sometimes attribute to historical figures, but the grinding daily courage required to continue existing when existence itself was an act of defiance against systems designed to crush them. They were not victims, though they were victimized. They were not helpless, though they were systematically disempowered. They were human beings doing their best to create meaningful lives within constraints that seem almost unimaginable today. The stories of medieval women like Marguerite matter not because they were exceptional, but because they were ordinary. They represent millions of women whose names history never recorded, whose struggles were never commemorated, whose sacrifices made possible the continuation of human civilization under conditions that tested the very limits of human endurance. The fire burns low in countless hearths as these ancient stories fade into the darkness. But somewhere in that gentle light lives the memory of all those who came before, all those who faced impossible choices with quiet dignity, all those whose love proved stronger than the systems that sought to destroy them. Their voices whisper across the centuries, reminding us how precious and fragile our freedoms truly are, how easily the rights we take for granted might be lost, how important it is to remember those who paid such terrible prices for the simple privilege of being human in a world that often denied their humanity entirely. Sleep comes slowly to medieval villages, and with it, dreams that offer no escape from waking horrors. For as the centuries turned and generations of women like Marguerite passed into memory, their daughters inherited not just their mother's spinning wheels and wooden spoons, but something far more precious and dangerous, the whispered knowledge of survival in a world designed to destroy them. Let your breathing settle now as we drift deeper into these forgotten lives, into the spaces between recorded history, where women's voices echo like prayers spoken in empty churches. Tonight, we explore not just how medieval women died, but how they lived, how they resisted, how they found ways to be human despite systems that treated them as less than livestock. The morning after Marguerite's burial, her daughter Marie wakes in a house that feels different, smaller somehow, as if her mother's absence has changed the very air they breathe. At barely 3 years old, Marie cannot understand why the woman who sang her to sleep will never return, cannot comprehend that she has just inherited a legacy of suffering that stretches back through countless generations of women who loved too much and lost too often. Henri has already begun making inquiries about a replacement wife. Not from callousness, though medieval men were hardly known for emotional sensitivity, but from simple necessity. A household without a woman was like a mill without water, technically functional, but practically useless. Children needed tending, meals required preparation, clothes demanded mending, and the endless cycle of domestic labour that kept families alive could not pause for grief or remembrance. The women who come to assess the situation speak in the coded language that medieval communities used when discussing uncomfortable truths. They examine the children with calculating eyes, not from cruelty, but from experience. Pierre, now 5 and sturdy, might be manageable. Little Thomas, still sickly from his difficult birth, would require constant attention. And Marie, well, girls were always more burden than blessing until they could be married off to become someone else's responsibility. But as these practical conversations unfold in hushed tones around kitchen fires and market stalls, something else is happening in the spaces between words, in the glances exchanged between women who understand what others cannot. Knowledge is being passed down, survival strategies shared, the accumulated wisdom of generations of women who learn to navigate impossible circumstances through sheer stubborn refusal to disappear entirely. This knowledge came in fragments, whispered during brief encounters when men were absent. Which herbs might prevent pregnancy, though using them carried the risk of accusations of witchcraft. How to recognize the signs of a husband's growing violence, though there was little that could be done to prevent it. Ways to hide small amounts of food or money, creating tiny reserves that might mean the difference between life and death during the inevitable crises that punctuated medieval existence. The women who possessed this knowledge were careful about sharing it, for good reason. To be caught teaching other women how to control their fertility could result in charges of practicing dark magic. To be seen helping a neighbour escape an abusive husband might bring accusations of interfering with divine order. Even the simple act of showing too much sympathy for another woman's suffering could be interpreted as dangerous thinking, evidence of the kind of feminine solidarity that threatened male authority. Yet somehow, the knowledge persisted. It passed from mother to daughter in fragments, disguised as cooking tips or gardening advice. It travelled between friends in seemingly innocent conversations about weather and children. It survived in the songs women sang while working, in the stories they told around evening fires, in the prayers they whispered over their children's sleeping forms. This underground network of feminine knowledge was perhaps the closest thing medieval women had to real power, though it was power exercised in shadows and silence. A midwife who knew which plants might ease childbirth pain. A wise woman who could identify the early signs of dangerous pregnancies. A grandmother who remembered which seasons brought disease and how families might prepare for lean times ahead. These women walked a careful line between helping their sisters and protecting themselves from accusations of witchcraft or heresy. They shared their knowledge selectively, trusting only those whose desperation outweighed the risks of seeking forbidden assistance. They spoke in metaphors and symbols, using language that could be interpreted innocently if overheard by the wrong ears. The Church, ever vigilant against threats to its authority, viewed this feminine knowledge network with deep suspicion. Priests preached against women who claimed medical expertise, warning that such knowledge could only come from diabolic sources. They encouraged wives to report any neighbors who seemed too knowledgeable about herbs or healing, who offered assistance that smacked of unnatural wisdom. This religious paranoia had devastating consequences for women who possessed genuine medical knowledge or midwifery skills. Many found themselves accused of practicing witchcraft simply because they understood how to ease suffering or prevent disease. The very compassion that drove them to help others became evidence of their supposed corruption, their healing hands transformed into instruments of evil in the fevered imagination of a society terrified of feminine power. Yet even under this constant threat of persecution, women continued to care for each other in whatever ways they could. They attended births despite knowing that any complications might be blamed on their supposed dark arts. They tended the sick even when such care put their own safety at risk. They preserved traditional remedies and practical wisdom despite official condemnation of their activities. The courage required for such persistence was extraordinary, though medieval women themselves would not have recognized it as courage. To them, it was simply necessity, the natural response of creatures who understood that no one else would protect them if they did not protect each other. They created informal safety nets in communities that offered no formal protection, built systems of mutual aid in societies that viewed feminine solidarity as dangerous rebellion. These networks operated below the surface of recorded history, leaving few traces in the official documents that form our primary sources for medieval life. We must read between the lines of court records and church chronicles to glimpse their existence, searching for hints and suggestions in texts written by men who often failed to notice or understand the parallel world of feminine community that existed alongside their own. But occasionally, evidence surfaces of the remarkable organizational abilities that medieval women developed, despite their exclusion from formal power structures. We find records of women's guilds that provided support for widows and orphans. We discover accounts of female religious communities that operated schools and hospitals. We uncover traces of economic networks that allowed women to engage in trade and commerce despite legal restrictions on their activities. These glimpses suggest that medieval women were far from the passive victims that official histories might suggest. Within the severe constraints of their circumstances, they found ways to exercise agency, to make choices, to influence the world around them. Their power was limited and often invisible, but it was real nonetheless, expressed through relationships and knowledge rather than formal authority. The education that women created for themselves bore little resemblance to the classical learning available to men. It focused on practical skills and survival strategies, rather than abstract philosophy or theological speculation. But it was education, nonetheless. A systematic transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next, designed to help women navigate the particular challenges of their existence. This feminine curriculum included not just domestic skills like cooking and textile work, but complex understanding of human psychology, family dynamics, and social navigation. Women learned to read the subtle signs that might indicate a husband's growing violence, to recognize which neighbors could be trusted and which might betray confidences, to manage household resources during times of scarcity. They developed sophisticated systems for preserving and sharing information, despite their exclusion from literacy. Songs served as memory aids for complex recipes or medical treatments. Stories encoded warnings about dangerous situations or people. Riddles and proverbs contained practical wisdom disguised as entertainment. The oral tradition that preserved this knowledge was remarkably resilient, surviving persecution, social upheaval, and the constant threat of being lost when its carriers died young or were silenced by violence. Each generation of women inherited this legacy and added their own discoveries, creating an ever-evolving body of practical wisdom that helped their sisters survive impossible circumstances. But survival came at a cost that extended far beyond individual suffering. The constant stress of living without security, of facing daily threats without protection, of watching children die from preventable causes, created patterns of trauma that passed from mother to daughter across generations. Medieval women learned to expect loss, to guard their hearts against attachments that might be severed without warning, to find meaning in lives that offered little hope for happiness or fulfillment. This psychological adaptation was necessary for survival, but it came with consequences that shaped the entire culture. Children raised by mothers who had learned to expect betrayal and loss inherited patterns of mistrust and emotional guardedness. Communities composed of individuals trained from birth to prioritize survival over flourishing developed social structures that prioritize stability over justice, order over compassion. The medieval world's casual acceptance of feminine suffering was not simply the result of individual cruelty or ignorance. It was a systematic response to social conditions that made such suffering seem inevitable, even necessary. In a world where resources were scarce and survival uncertain, societies developed mechanisms for distributing suffering unequally, ensuring that some groups bore heavier burdens so that others might have lighter loads. Women became one of the primary shock absorbers in this system, expected to sacrifice their own needs and desires for the benefit of families and communities that offered them little in return. Their willingness to accept such sacrifices was not evidence of natural feminine selflessness, as medieval theologians claimed, but the result of social conditioning that left them no alternative. The remarkable thing is not that medieval women suffered so much, but that they found ways to maintain their humanity despite suffering. They continued to love their children, knowing how easily those children might be lost. They formed friendships despite social structures designed to isolate them. They preserved traditions of beauty and creativity despite lives that offered little time for such luxuries. Their resilience was not the romanticized strength that modern observers sometimes attribute to historical figures, but something more complex and more admirable: the grinding, daily courage required to continue caring about life when life seemed designed to crush all caring from their hearts. They were not saints or martyrs, though they were often sainted and martyred. They were human beings doing their best to create meaning within systems that seemed designed to drain all meaning from existence. The winter nights grow longer now, and in that darkness lies the memory of countless medieval women who faced similar challenges with quiet dignity. Their stories matter not because they were extraordinary, but because they were ordinary, representing millions of women whose names history never recorded, but whose love and sacrifice made possible the continuation of human civilization, under conditions that tested the very limits of human endurance. As you drift towards sleep, carried by these ancient voices, remember that their struggles were not in vain. Every small act of kindness they showed each other, every moment of beauty they created despite ugly circumstances, every child they managed to keep alive for one more day, contributed to the long, slow process of human progress that eventually led to worlds where women might have choices they could never imagine. Their courage echoes across the centuries, reminding us how precious our freedoms are and how easily they might be lost. In honoring their memory, we honor something essential about the human spirit: its capacity to find light in darkness, to create love in loveless places, to persist in hoping even when hope seems foolish. The fire burns low in countless medieval hearths, but somewhere in that gentle light lives the enduring strength of women who refuse to let impossible circumstances destroy their capacity for compassion. Their legacy is not recorded in official histories, but it lives on in every act of kindness between women, every moment of mutual support, every choice to care for others despite the personal cost. Let their whispered voices carry you now toward rest. These mothers and daughters and sisters who found ways to be human in an inhuman world, whose quiet victories over despair made possible all the victories that would follow. Sleep now, and dream of them, these forgotten heroines whose stories deserve to be remembered, whose courage deserves to be celebrated, whose love proves stronger than all the forces that sought to destroy it. The darkness settles gently around their memory, but in that darkness burns a light that no medieval cruelty could extinguish, the eternal flame of human compassion that passes from heart to heart across all the centuries that separate us from their struggles. They are at peace now, these long-suffering women, and their rest has been earned through trials we can barely imagine, through sacrifices that humble our modern complaints, through love that transcended every limitation their world tried to place upon it. Their peace settles around us now like morning mist over forgotten churchyards, but their stories have more to tell. For as the centuries turned and kingdoms rose and fell, the fundamental structures that defined women's lives remained as unchanging as stone walls around a prison yard. Each generation inherited not just their mother's spinning wheels and cooking pots, but the invisible chains that bound them to predetermined destinies. Let your thoughts drift now to a different village, a different century, where another young woman named Agnes opens her eyes to the harsh light of medieval dawn. The year is 1203, and though nearly 2 centuries separate her from our Marguerite, the world she inhabits might as well be carved from the same unforgiving stone. Agnes is 14, already considered past the ideal age for marriage, her father growing anxious about the dowry he must scrape together from harvests that never seem adequate. But Agnes carries within her something that sets her apart from the resigned acceptance that marked so many of her sisters. Perhaps it's the stubborn streak she inherited from her grandmother, a woman who once scandalized the village by refusing to remarry after her husband's death. Or maybe it's simply the particular way suffering had shaped her spirit, not into submission, but into a quiet, burning determination to find some small space of agency in a world that offered women none. She has learned to read, this Agnes, taught in secret by the village priest, who saw something in her quick mind that deserved nurturing despite the dangers such knowledge might bring. The ability to decipher the scratches and marks that others dismissed as meaningless symbols opens doorways in her imagination, allows her to glimpse possibilities that extend beyond the narrow confines of her expected future. She reads the lives of saints and discovers women who found power through spiritual devotion, who carved out spaces of authority within the very religious structures that otherwise oppressed them. But reading brings its own torments, for knowledge without the power to act upon it becomes a special form of torture. Agnes learns about distant lands where different customs might offer different opportunities, about queens and abbesses who wielded influence over the affairs of men, about philosophical ideas that challenge the fundamental assumptions of her world. Yet all of this understanding remains trapped within her skull, as useless as gold coins in a beggar's pocket, beautiful, but ultimately unable to purchase the freedom she craves. The conversations around her dinner table follow familiar patterns, her parents debating which local men might be suitable husbands, what arrangements might be negotiated, how her future might be traded away to secure temporary advantages for a family perpetually balanced on the knife's edge of survival. They speak of her as if she were livestock being prepared for market. evaluating her qualities with the same dispassionate calculation they might apply to a cow or sheep. Agnes listens to these discussions with growing dread, not because she fears marriage itself, but because she understands with terrible clarity what marriage means in her world. The complete surrender of whatever small autonomy she has managed to carve out for herself, the end of her secret reading sessions, the abandonment of her private thoughts, the transformation of her body into an instrument for producing heirs who will belong entirely to their father. She has watched other girls disappear into marriage as if swallowed by quicksand, their personalities dimming like candles deprived of air, until nothing remains but hollow-eyed women who speak only when spoken to, and seem to have forgotten they once had dreams of their own. The lucky ones adapt quickly, finding some measure of contentment in the narrow roles assigned to them. The unlucky ones fade slowly, their spirits crushed by husbands who see them as inconvenient necessities, their bodies broken by pregnancies that come too frequently and too dangerously. The winter of Agnes's 14th year brings news that changes everything, though not in ways anyone could have predicted. A Norman lord, seeking to expand his holdings in this remote corner of England, has decided that strategic marriages might serve his purposes better than costly military campaigns. He offers generous dowries to local families willing to marry their daughters to his knights and retainers. Men far from home who need wives to establish their legitimacy in this conquered land. Agnes's father sees opportunity in this development, a chance to secure his daughter's future while gaining the protection that comes with noble connections. The dowry offered is more than he could have hoped to provide himself. The proposed husband, a man of established position and proven valour. On the surface, it appears to be a stroke of extraordinary good fortune, the kind of advantageous match that peasant families could rarely dream of achieving. But Agnes, with her dangerous literacy and her stubborn streak, begins to ask questions that others prefer not to voice. She wants to know about this knight's previous marriages, about the fate of his former wives, about the conditions she might expect in his household. Her inquiries are met with sharp rebukes from her parents, who view such curiosity as dangerous impertinence. A wife's duty is to trust and obey, not to investigate and evaluate. The negotiations proceed with the inexorable momentum of avalanches, sweeping aside any objections or hesitations in their path. Contracts are drawn up, agreements reached, arrangements finalized. Agnes finds herself engaged to Sir Roderick de Montfort, a man she has never met, whose age and temperament remain mysteries, whose expectations and demands will soon define every aspect of her existence. The wedding preparations unfold around her like a fever dream, familiar yet alien, recognizable from countless other village celebrations, yet profoundly different because of the elevated status of the groom. There are fine fabrics to be procured, elaborate ceremonies to be planned, important guests to be accommodated. Agnes becomes a figure in someone else's pageant, dressed and positioned and instructed in the proper performance of her role as grateful bride. But even as the machinery of medieval marriage grinds toward its inevitable conclusion, Agnes continues her secret resistance. She uses her literacy to write letters to distant convents, inquiring about the possibility of religious life as an alternative to marriage. She researches the legal requirements for annulment, searching for loopholes that might free her from unwanted vows. She even considers the desperate option of flight, though she knows that a woman traveling alone would face dangers that might make marriage seem preferable by comparison. Her clandestine activities are discovered, as such things usually are in small communities where privacy is a luxury few can afford. Her parents react with horror and fury, interpreting her resistance as ingratitude of the most shameful kind. They have secured her an advantageous marriage, lifted her above her birth station, provided her with opportunities that most girls in her position could never hope to achieve. Her unwillingness to embrace these gifts seems to them evidence of dangerous pride, of the kind of rebellious spirit that brings divine punishment down upon entire families. The confrontation that follows reveals the full extent of the forces arrayed against any woman who dares to question her prescribed destiny. Her father, normally a gentle man worn down by years of hard labor and constant worry, becomes a stranger filled with righteous anger at her defiance. Her mother, who might have been expected to show some sympathy for a daughter's fears, instead delivers the harshest condemnation, speaking of feminine duty and divine submission with the fervor of a true believer. Agnes realizes in that moment that she stands entirely alone, that even the women who share her circumstances have been so thoroughly conditioned to accept their fate that they cannot recognize resistance as anything other than sinful rebellion. The isolation is complete and devastating, cutting her off not just from support, but from the possibility that anyone might understand her perspective or validate her concerns. The wedding day arrives with the inexorability of winter storms, bringing with it pageantry that masks the essential brutality of the transaction taking place. Agnes meets her husband for the first time at the altar, looking up into a face marked by campaigns in distant lands, scarred by battles she cannot imagine, hardened by experiences that have left no room for gentleness or consideration. Sir Roderick examines his bride with the calculating gaze of a merchant evaluating purchased goods, noting her youth and health with satisfaction while showing no interest in her thoughts or feelings. The ceremony itself passes in a blur of Latin phrases she only partially understands, of vows that commit her to a lifetime of submission to a man whose character remains entirely unknown to her. She speaks the required words because she has no choice, but each syllable feels like a small death, the systematic dismantling of whatever autonomy she had managed to preserve through her brief years of relative freedom. The celebration that follows reveals the stark differences between her old life and the new existence that awaits her. The guests include nobles and knights, whose conversations revolve around warfare and politics, subjects from which she is excluded by both custom and gender. She sits beside her new husband like a decorative ornament, present but not participating, observed but not consulted, celebrated but not truly welcomed into the masculine world that will now define her boundaries. Sir Roderick proves to be exactly what Agnes had feared, a man who views his wife as property acquired for specific purposes, whose expectations are both clear and non-negotiable. Her literacy, which she had hoped might provide some small avenue for intellectual engagement, is dismissed as an unseemly accomplishment that proper wives should abandon. Her questions about his previous marriages are met with sharp rebukes that make clear such curiosity will not be tolerated. Her attempts to establish some small measure of equality in their interactions are crushed with the casual efficiency of a man accustomed to absolute obedience from subordinates. The household she enters reflects these attitudes in every detail. The servants, all male, treat her with the polite indifference reserved for objects of little importance. The castle itself, while impressive in its scale and appointments, feels more like a prison than a home, its high walls and narrow windows designed to keep enemies out and inhabitants in. Her chambers, while luxurious by the standards of her birth, become the boundaries of a world that grows smaller with each passing day. Agnes discovers that elevation in social status does not necessarily translate into improvements in women's conditions. While she now has servants to perform the physical labor that had filled her previous days, she has even less control over her own life than she had as a peasant daughter. Her time is not her own. Her movements require permission. Her interactions are monitored and regulated. She has traded the hard, but relatively straightforward oppression of peasant life for the more subtle, but equally complete control exercised over noble wives. The pregnancy that follows within months of her marriage brings with it all the familiar terrors of medieval childbirth, but with additional complications born of her elevated status. The attention focused on her condition is intense and unwelcome, every symptom analysed and debated by physicians whose theoretical knowledge far exceeds their practical competence. She is subjected to treatments that seem designed more to demonstrate medical learning than to promote health, bloodlettings, and purges that leave her weaker rather than stronger. The birth itself unfolds in a chamber filled with strangers, noble ladies who attend not from friendship but from social obligation, physicians who view her labour as an opportunity to display their expertise, servants who perform their duties with professional detachment. Agnes finds herself longing for the simple companionship of village women, for the practical wisdom of midwives who learned their craft through experience rather than study, for the genuine concern of mothers who understood suffering because they had endured it themselves. The child, when finally born, proves to be a daughter, a development that brings disappointment rather than celebration to the assembled company. Sir Roderick's reaction reveals the extent to which his interest in his wife was purely utilitarian, focused on her ability to produce male heirs rather than any appreciation for her as an individual. The daughter, though healthy and beautiful, represents a kind of failure, evidence that Agnes has not yet fulfilled her primary function as a wife. The months that follow blur together in a haze of isolation and purposelessness that Agnes finds more difficult to bear than the physical hardships of her previous life. She has comfort but no agency, luxury but no freedom, status but no respect. Her days are filled with meaningless activities designed to occupy her time without engaging her mind, needlework and prayer and social calls that serve no purpose beyond maintaining appearances. The depression that settles over her is profound but unnamed, for medieval medicine had no vocabulary for describing the psychological toll of powerlessness and isolation. Agnes experiences her despair as moral failing, as evidence of feminine weakness, as proof that she lacks the spiritual fortitude necessary for her elevated position. The guilt compounds her suffering, creating cycles of self-blame that make recovery even more difficult. Her attempts to find purpose through religious devotion are discouraged by a husband who views excessive piety as unseemly in a wife. Her efforts to engage with the intellectual life of the court are dismissed as inappropriate feminine curiosity. Even her maternal instincts are channeled through wet nurses and governesses who handle the practical aspects of child rearing, while she remains a decorative presence in her daughter's life. The second pregnancy arrives with grim inevitability, bringing with it renewed hope for a male heir and fresh reminders of the physical dangers that defined every medieval woman's existence. This time, however, Agnes approaches childbirth with a kind of desperate recklessness, almost welcoming the possibility that labour might provide an escape from a life that has become unbearable in its emptiness and constraint. The birth proves more difficult than the first, complicated by Agnes's deteriorating health and emotional state. The physicians who attend her seem more interested in their theoretical discussions than in her practical needs, debating the proper balance of humours while she struggles through hours of increasingly dangerous labour. When complications arise, their treatments prove not just ineffective, but actively harmful, weakening her further at the moment when she most needs strength. The son who finally emerges from this ordeal arrives at a cost that will mark Agnes for the rest of her life. Something essential has been damaged in the process, some capacity for healing that will never fully return. She survives, but as a diminished version of herself, physically weakened and emotionally numbed by trauma that no one acknowledges or addresses. Sir Roderick's satisfaction with the production of a male heir provides temporary respite from his demands for additional children, but Agnes understands that this reprieve is only temporary. Medieval noble families required multiple sons as insurance against the constant threats of disease, accident, and warfare. She faces the prospect of repeated pregnancies that will likely kill her, each birth rolling the dice again with death until death finally wins. The winter that follows her son's birth stretches endlessly before her, filled with the same purposeless activities that have defined her noble existence. But something has changed in Agnes during her recent ordeal. Some final breaking point reached and passed. The woman who once secretly taught herself to read, who dared to question arrangements made on her behalf, who dreamed of alternatives to predetermined destinies, begins to stir again beneath the layers of conditioning and despair. Perhaps it is the proximity of death during childbirth that awakens her dormant rebellion. Perhaps it is the realization that she has nothing left to lose, having already surrendered everything that once made life meaningful. Or perhaps it is simply the stubborn streak inherited from her grandmother, finally reasserting itself after months of enforced submission. Agnes begins to make plans, not for escape this time, but for a different kind of resistance. She starts writing again, not letters seeking alternatives, but chronicles of her experience, detailed accounts of what noble marriage actually entails for the women trapped within it. She documents the casual cruelties, the systematic isolation, the gradual erosion of identity that transforms vibrant young women into hollow-eyed ornaments. Her writing becomes both outlet and weapon, a way of preserving her sense of self while creating testimony that might someday serve other women facing similar circumstances. She hides her work carefully, understanding that discovery would bring punishment that might extend beyond herself to endanger her children. But the act of writing itself provides something she had thought lost forever: a sense of purpose that no one else can define or control. The servants begin to notice changes in their mistress, subtle shifts in demeanor that suggest some internal transformation. She speaks more frequently and with greater authority, makes decisions about household matters without seeking permission, demonstrates a growing indifference to her husband's approval or disapproval. These changes are small and carefully calibrated, designed to test boundaries without triggering violent responses. Sir Roderick, preoccupied with military campaigns and political machinations, initially fails to recognize the significance of his wife's evolving behavior. When he does begin to notice, his reactions follow predictable patterns of masculine outrage at feminine insubordination. But Agnes has learned to read the signs of impending violence, to calculate risks and benefits, to choose her battles with strategic precision. The dance that develops between them reflects broader patterns of power and resistance that have characterized relationships between men and women throughout history. He attempts to reassert control through increasingly harsh measures, while she finds more subtle ways to maintain whatever small spaces of autonomy she can carve out for herself. Neither acknowledges the conflict openly, but both understand that fundamental questions about authority and submission are being contested in their daily interactions. The children become both weapons and shields in this undeclared war, their needs and welfare providing justification for actions that might otherwise be seen as unacceptable defiance. Agnes uses her maternal authority to make decisions about their education and upbringing, gradually expanding her sphere of influence while appearing to act only from conventional feminine concern for her offspring's welfare. Her daughter, now old enough to observe and understand some of what transpires around her, becomes an unwitting witness to possibilities that few medieval girls ever glimpsed. She sees a mother who speaks her mind despite consequences, who makes decisions despite lacking formal authority, who maintains dignity despite systematic attempts to crush her spirit. These lessons, transmitted through example rather than explicit instruction, plant seeds that may someday bloom into their own forms of resistance. The years pass with their familiar rhythm of seasons and ceremonies, births and deaths, harvests and famines. Agnes ages but does not fade, her face acquiring lines that speak of struggle rather than submission, her eyes maintaining a spark that no amount of oppression can entirely extinguish. She becomes something unprecedented in her world, a noble wife who has found ways to resist without destroying herself or her family, who has created meaning within meaninglessness, who has preserved her humanity despite systems designed to strip it away. Her story spreads quietly through networks of women who recognize in her example something precious and rare, proof that complete surrender is not inevitable, that small victories are possible even under the most crushing circumstances, that the human spirit can find ways to survive and even flourish in conditions that seem designed to destroy it entirely. The fire burns low in castle hearths as winter deepens, but somewhere in that gentle light lives the memory of a woman who refused to disappear, who found ways to matter in a world that insisted she was meaningless, who created legacy through the simple act of refusing to surrender her essential self to forces that demanded nothing less than complete annihilation of her identity. Her whispered rebellion echoes across centuries, reminding us that resistance takes many forms, that victory can be measured in moments rather than lifetimes, that even the smallest assertion of human dignity carries within it the seeds of larger transformations that may not bloom for generations, but will eventually flower in ways their planters could never imagine.